Presenting requirements is a lot like presenting in general. The biggest difference is the material itself. There's a lot of information to cover, and you're always moving in the direction of gaining approvals from the stakeholders who you are presenting to. In this section of the lecture on finalizing requirements, we're going to spend the majority of the time focusing on how to present the requirements artifacts that you've created in the earlier phases, and then give some overall advice on handling the walkthrough process. Before we get started on that, let's talk about some of the mechanics of the requirements walkthrough. First, when setting up the meeting, you have to decide who to include and find a time that works for most people, and also determine whether it'll be in person or over a conference call. My rules of thumb for figuring these questions out is essentially as follows. Who to include? Well, definitely include everyone on your core project team. So that's your project manager, your development team, your testing team, and, well, any other business analysts that may be working with you on the project. You also need to include the stakeholders you've identified during the requirements formation process. All those people who gave you requirements, showed you how they do the work today, etc. It's never a bad idea to include your boss and the bosses of your peers on the project team also, but they're kind of secondary depending on your organization. So, you can consider them to be optional. When coming up with this list, it's a good idea to run it by your project manager first, just to make sure that you have all the right people. Believe it or not, scheduling the meeting can be a tricky endeavor itself, just because in our current economy, your walkthrough participants probably have busy schedules. For this reason, it's a good idea to identify the 5 or 6 most critical stakeholders and work around their schedules. So people like the project sponsor, people like the people that have given you the most input on requirements, that kind of thing. Things also get a bit trickier when you have stakeholders on multiple continents and therefore multiple time zones. You might end up not only having to have a conference call to go through it, which isn't perfect, but it's acceptable. But you might end up having to conduct more than one walkthrough because of the lack of overlap in the working day, that kind of thing. Whatever the case, that's fine. Usually it doesn't impact the walkthroughs that much. It just adds to the amount of work that you have to do. I kind of just alluded to this, but I recommend always trying to conduct the walkthrough in person. But, since a lot of our organizations are geographically dispersed, which necessitates some kind of conference call setup. What's tricky about this is that you're walking your audience through a document as well, right? So I suggest you use an online presentation tool like NetMeeting or GoToMeeting or whatever you use, just to keep everybody on the same page. Okay, so that's the overall general advice. Let's move on to the presentation itself. The first topic is going to be laying the foundation, how to begin the meeting so you start your audience off on the right foot. Usually at the beginning of the meeting, you should greet everyone and get down to business pretty soon after the meeting time is reached. It's a good idea to lay down any ground rules, and those vary based on the culture of your business, but at the very least, you should tell everyone that you need everyone's feedback and that you welcome questions, corrections, criticism, any input. After that, I suggest continuing with a brief description of what the organization's problem is and why you're doing the project in the first place. You might say, for example, and this is just a little blurb that I put up on the screen. I'll just read through it. Earlier this year, company management determined that we need to launch a line of sports beverage products. One of the challenges we face, however, is that we don't have a system for tracking sales and inventory of the upcoming beverage product line, which is needed to manage the business. We started defining requirements for the sports beverage sales tracking system several weeks ago, working with many of you to figure out what the system needs to do. And today we want to run through the requirements with you so we can get the approval process started and move on with the project. Boom. Okay, that gets the job done. It's about, let's say, a 30-second introduction, and generally that's a good amount of time. You don't want to spend too little time and confuse people, and you don't want to spend too much time because there's a lot to cover requirements-wise. Just to highlight a few things from the intro I just provided, there was a reason behind the structure here. First, we have the background, and that's the first little paragraph that you see on the screen. Earlier this year, company management determined, etc. It's just a single sentence, but it sets us up to talk about what the problem was that the project will solve. After that, we have the problem statement itself. One of the challenges we face, however, is we don't have a system. Next, you introduce the concept of requirements. You haven't just been sitting around thinking, you've been coming up with a solution. So we started defining requirements for the sports beverage sales tracking system several weeks ago. One other thing I like about the statement is that it says, hey, I, as the business analyst, I've been working with you, the stakeholders, to devise this solution. That reminds the audience that this is a collaborative effort and that you've been coming up with the solution together. That really brings everybody to the same side of the table. Then the last sentence there, starting with, and today we want to run through, there's actually two parts to that. We end with, one, what we're doing in that meeting, and two, why we're doing it, so that they can understand the requirements and get the approval process started. And from here, after making an introductory kind of overview, you get on with presenting the requirements.